So in the event you thought you were someplace other than Job, you're in the wrong place. If you're supposed to be in a thing on Job, you're in the right place. Not that we have anything else going on in our Zoom channel right now, so I don't know how you got the username and password otherwise. So we're doing Job part 2. We actually have darn near 3/4 of the book of Job to traverse before we're actually done with the text of the book itself. And then there's other stuff about the book that we probably also want to talk about, because Job is one of the pieces of biblical literature that has a lot of parallels in ancient Near Eastern texts. And actually, because it's one of the later biblical books, spends a lot of time talking about and interpreting other biblical books in some pretty interesting ways. We started to look at that last week a little bit. We're really going to see a lot of it this week. I decided to kind of, rather than have us go through, there's 3 cycles of arguments between Job and his friends, and rather than really dig into all 3 cycles, which gets very repetitive, we'll actually look really closely at the first cycle, which makes all the arguments anyway, but then lets us really pick apart what's happening with how Job was written, because it's actually a shame from my perspective that we don't ever force biblical Hebrew students to read Job, because they would learn a lot from that exercise, not just about Hebrew. So before we kind of dive into it, I have a part 1 recap. It's a longish recap. It's a few slides, but there was a lot to cover. So we talked about last week that Job fits into kind of a broader tradition of Israelite and Second Temple Jewish wisdom literature, where Proverbs is kind of like the paradigm of the tradition, lots and lots and lots of statements about what wisdom is and how wisdom is beneficial. Ecclesiastes sort of agrees that wisdom is effective, but questions the point of the whole exercise. Like, well, I'm doing great in my life, but I'm going to die anyway, so how does this help me? And Job actually just is a full-scale assault on the idea of wisdom, and a little bit more broadly on the premises of Israelite religion. And we'll really get to see the attack on Israelite religion today. We looked at it a little bit, but today we're going to really dig into some of what's happening, a lot of which is really very subtle. Job and Ecclesiastes each sound skeptical notes. Neither actually really reject broad ideas of divine authority. So they're kind of skeptical predecessors, but they are not atheists. They are not really humanists exactly. They are tied into human and everyday concerns, but it's in a different way. And we'll actually see, depending on how far we get, we'll actually see that Job seems to accept as legitimate all kinds of things about the beasts and gods of the ancient Near East as being at least true for rhetorical purposes. As a text, Job is almost entirely poetry. There are a few pieces of prose, but not much. Like other wisdom literature, there's a lot of naturalist imagery, not a lot of philosophical discourse, but Job is unique in how much vocabulary gets used and how often there are one-off words that appear nowhere else in biblical literature, but that appear in Job, because you can only say the same thing so many times without having to pick new words, lest you just repeat the same words over and over again. The text of Job as received has defects. We're not going to see them in depth, but there are a number of sections where it appears as though sections of chapters have been copied out of order. And so in chapters 25 and 26, there are actually sets of verses that belong in the other chapter. And then things are out of order, suggesting that Job wasn't all that carefully transmitted for a while. There have been efforts to reconstruct it. Everything's speculative. We have no Hebrew, we have no full text of the Tanakh in Hebrew older than the 10th century BC, 10th century CE. So There's a lot we don't know about how it was transmitted. The entire book of Job isn't at Qumran, at Dead Sea Scrolls, so there's a lot we don't really know about how things should be put together. Our plot so far, to the extent there's a plot, Job is righteous, children maybe less so. Yahweh and the adversary wager on whether Job will keep honoring Yahweh if his good life is destroyed. Yahweh says, I'll take that bet, and Job's life is destroyed. But he still doesn't curse Yahweh. Job's friends come to visit and console him, and a debate ensues as to whether Job is right about the unrightness of his suffering. Job and his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, go through 3 cycles of debate. The 3rd cycle is actually lacking Zophar's speech. We don't know if there was never a Zophar speech and it was lost because it was never written, or whether it was lost because somebody composed it and then it fell out. Anything is possible. We know that the text of Job has some stuff that's been copied weirdly. It's possible something just got lost. Last time we kind of looked at Job's initial lament, his whole, okay, well, I want to die now. That is really kind of chapters 3 and 4. His friend Eliphaz's first speech and Job's response. And Eliphaz responds to the I'm being unfairly punished by saying, well, you know, if you're being punished, you probably should accept that you did something wrong. Otherwise, you're a hypocrite. You're human and you're flawed, and angels are imperfect. So what do you think you're going to accomplish? And Yahweh's power and righteousness are manifest, and you must be wrong. We just are going to assume you're wrong because you're suffering, and that means that you did something bad. And Job says, if I'm in the wrong, demonstrate it, but you haven't told me how I was doing anything bad. If humans are insignificant, why pay us any mind and why afflict us, right? This is the upside down parody of what is man that you are mindful of him. Job's point is something like Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof, right? Tevye kind of says at one point, you know, couldn't you pick on someone else every once in a while? We're the chosen people, but couldn't you choose someone else every now and then? That's kind of what Job's argument is here a little bit. And again, Job's contention isn't that Yahweh isn't powerful, it's that what's happening isn't right and there must have been a mistake. Because Job doesn't know that really he's just been the subject of a bet. Job's author is familiar with wisdom literature in the Psalms. We looked at his use of Ecclesiastes a little bit. We looked at his use of Psalms a little bit. And he uses that knowledge to attack these traditions. As before, most of the translations of the Tanakh I've taken from Robert Alter's The Hebrew Bible, just to be consistent. Even though we're going to see today that some of how Robert Alter translated things hides some important stuff about how all of this pieces itself together. So Job and his friends continued. So Bildad is friend number 2. So we had Eliphaz, Bildad, the last one is Zophar. And these are each of them tribesmen from different pre-Israelite tribes. Job is also pre-Israelite. This whole thing is supposed to be set kind of before there are Israelites, which makes its insight somehow more universal. So Job responds to Eliphaz, and then Bildad speaks up. And Bildad first says, Job's words are empty. If you just confessed that you did something wrong, God will make you more prosperous than ever you were before, right? So how long will you jabber? The words of your mouth, one huge wind. Would God pervert justice? Should I pervert what is right? If your children offended him, he dispatched them because of their crime. If you were honest and pure, by now he would rouse himself for you and would make your righteous home whole. Then your beginning would seem a trifle and your latter day very grand. So this is Bildad saying, you thought you were rich before, just say you're sorry, and you will have much more than you had before. This ironically turns out to be mostly what happens with Job, though not for the reason Bildad says exactly. And then we get this next verse. for ask, pray, generations of old, taken what their fathers found out. So Bildad is referring to some ancient wisdom. And it's parallel to a verse from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 32:7 says, remember the days of old, give thoughts to the years of times past. Ask your father that he may tell you, your elders that they may say to you. And if you look at the bolded words, you can see that there's kind of a reuse of the word dor, which means generation, sha'al, which means ask, and av, so this is avotam, their fathers, and this is avicha, your father. But it's pretty clear by pushing all of these together that there's a kind of a call out, a paraphrased callback to Deuteronomy. Job is late enough in the game that Deuteronomy has probably mostly already been written. So the earliest date most people put on Deuteronomy is 612 BCE, but people also largely agree it didn't really get pieced together fully until maybe the 5th century, which is kind of when Job is written, hypothetically as well. So Job, the author of Job, knows Deuteronomy, and he's grabbing words from it and he's ringing the bells for you to go back and look at what's in Deuteronomy and to compare it. And there's this extra irony to this particular choice. So Deuteronomy 32:7 is the 7th verse of the Torah portion, Ha'azinu. Nobody knows Ha'azinu unless they know Hebrew, but what you may have heard is lend your ear, O earth. Right? That's the opening of Moses's last speech. Ha'azinu just means lend your ear, listen. So the irony is that Job is pulling this speech where Moses is telling people to listen to your ancestors and to follow the Torah, putting it in Bildad's mouth so that when Job comes back to argue against Bildad, he's arguing against Deuteronomy. Bildad is taking Deuteronomy and repeating it, and Job is going to criticize Bildad, and in doing so, he's actually criticizing Deuteronomy, which means he's criticizing the premise of the book. The premise of the book of Deuteronomy is do good stuff and you'll prosper. Do bad stuff, you'll suffer. Which is exactly one of the ideas Job is attacking. So he's making these very intentional grabs of Hebrew from other parts of what we recognize as the Tanakh and using that to criticize those books. If you would only do what is right and acknowledge your fault, if you were to read the book of Psalms, you would hear phrases like these. God will not spurn the blameless nor hold the hand of evildoers. He will fill your mouth with laughter, your lips with a shout of joy. Your foes will be clothed with disgrace and the tent of the wicked gone. So this language is not exactly from the Psalms, but it's Psalm type stuff. Guarantees of prosperity, guarantees of triumphing over your enemies. And Job is putting this again into Bildad's mouth, right? He's grabbing these texts that seem approving of the old tradition, putting them into the mouth of somebody that's then going to be argued against by Job. And Job responds and says, well, maybe you're right about Yahweh's power. In fact, I agree, Yahweh is all powerful, and maybe my argument will get nowhere. Of course I knew it was so. How can a man be right before God? Should a person bring a grievance, he will not answer one of 1,000. So however many people bring a grievance against God, God is not answering most of them. Wise in mind, staunch in strength, who can argue with him and come out whole? We have no justification. Nevertheless, Job is going to make the argument. We're again recycling Deuteronomy here. So wise in mind, staunch in strength, who can argue with him and come out whole? So for Yahweh your guard hardened his spirit and toughened his heart in order to give him into your hand as on this day. The English translations here obscure the Hebrew because it's a literary translation. So he's translated the same Hebrew words in different places to do something different, because Robert Alter's purpose isn't to clue us into how Job is using Deuteronomy. He puts that in a footnote. His job is make Deuteronomy work as a thing that you read, make Job work as a thing that you read. But levav amitz koach mi hiksha, ki hiksha, rucho sounds a little bit like koach, ve'imetz et levavo, ve'amitz levav. So we've got these Hebrew words that are all being repeated. Job never grabs wholesale a verse from elsewhere in the Tanakh, but he recycles these words in order to be able to get you thinking about what's in that other section, because he's attacking it. And so the attack here is actually really difficult to see. You have to know what's in Deuteronomy 2 to know what Job is doing. So Deuteronomy 2 is saying Yahweh hardened his spirit. Whose spirit is in the prior part of the verse? King Sihon. And hardening his heart, so staunch in strength, hardening his heart to give him into your hand. By pulling these two verses together, what the author of Job is actually doing is saying, I'm like King Sihon right now, except I didn't do anything wrong. So when biblical verses are kind of hinted at, when Job is talking, they're very often used to critique whatever's happening behind the biblical verse. When they're cited by Job's friends, they're almost uncritically cited as oh, well, obviously God is just because, I'll paraphrase a psalm here. Oh, obviously God is just because Deuteronomy says so. Whereas Job is always, when Job is speaking, the verses are turned around and twisted to make the opposite point of whatever the verse really is trying to say sometimes. So that's kind of what's happening in his use of the Tanakh. And he can only do this, one, because he thinks you know all of these texts, and two, because he knows them. And he assumes that his readers are going to know them, which is a safe bet in his own time, because the class of people who are actually up to speed on reading wisdom literature and Deuteronomy and the Psalms is not a lot of people. There really aren't that many people living in the world of Second Temple Judaism. And then there are even fewer who can read, right? So who have the time and the money and the education to be able to read any of this. So he knows he's arguing probably to this. It's like people who specialize in certain academic fields. They're only writing for like 100 people. He's only writing for like 100 people. He's basically writing for the priests and the scribes. That's it. Those are the people who can read stuff. So it's elite literature. So he can assume that you know this stuff. We don't know this stuff, and you have to piece it apart when you come to it 2,500 years later. So Job says, oh, obviously, Yahweh is strong. He performs great things without limit and wonders without number. Sounds exactly like a couple of verses from Psalms, uses the same words. So wonders, niflaot gedolot, great wonders, ein cheker, without limit. These two verses are actually in the traditional morning weekday service, and actually in the Shabbat services as well. If you were to pick up a Siddur, each of these is recited multiple times in a day. So already these verses are ones that Job knows his readers would know. So they're already important, and they become more important in the Siddur as time goes on. But again, he's using Psalms as a critique. Why is he punishing me? He's so great. He does all these wonderful things. The chosen people, couldn't you pick on someone else every once in a while? Right? This is part of Job's argument is, well, if God's so great, why did he punish me? God will not relent his fury. Beneath him, Rahab's minions stoop. And yet, as for me, I would answer him, would choose my words with him. Though in the right, I can't make my plea. I would have to entreat my own judge. Should I call out and he answer me, I would not trust him to heed my voice. Though in the right, my mouth will convict me. I am blameless, yet he makes me crooked. So God will not relent his fury. Beneath him, Rahab's minions stoop. Because we just walk around talking about these ancient Canaanite gods like Rahab, right? You're supposed to know who this is. Well, now you know who it is. It's an ancient Canaanite god. So we're seeing a little bit of, we're accepting some of the mythology that we're supposed to not accept if we're using Deuteronomy as our guide. Right? Deuteronomy says, oh, you only have one place that you're supposed to worship. There's only one God. No, that's it. There are no other gods. And this is Job saying, well, actually, everybody knows, we think, about Rahab and Rahab's minions, because he assumes his readers know this. As for me, I would answer him, even though God will not answer, I am still going to demand a hearing. In the right, I can't make my plea. I would have to entreat my own judge. The only way anybody's going to listen to me is if I get my own judge, because clearly the judge is not listening to me. Should I call out and he answer me, I would not trust him to heed my voice. Not only is he not listening, if he did listen, and if God did listen and say, oh, well, this is why I did it, I don't trust him, because his actions up to now show he's in bad faith. Though in the right, my mouth will convict me. I am blameless, yet he makes me crooked. So we're taking a turn in Job's argument, and where Job is slowly going to go is to say, not just, I'm being unfairly punished. If my punishment is just, it's still unjust, because actually you made me do it, God. You're in charge. You shouldn't have let me do this. And we'll actually see him say that explicitly in a moment or two. Here it is. If I'm at fault, Yahweh made me be at fault. Life and kindness you gave me, your precept my spirit kept, yet these did you hide in your heart. I knew that this was with you. If I offended, you kept watch upon me, and of my crime would not acquit me. You stood there and watched me do it. You didn't stop me, and then you convicted me of doing the thing. If I was guilty, alas for me, and though innocent, I could not raise my head, sated with shame and surfeited with disgrace. If I was guilty, I should have been punished, but actually, I was innocent, you made me do it, and yet I still can't get clear of it. Because even though I'm innocent, you're punishing me. So this is Job taking seriously, for the purpose of argument, the entire premise of the book of Deuteronomy. You do good stuff, you'll prosper. You do bad stuff, you suffer. And saying, but it didn't work. The prophets have been saying, the wisdom literature has said, if I do these things, I'll be okay. And look what happened. And all of that stuff is supposed to have come from Yahweh. So actually, it's Yahweh's fault. And that's going to be part of the thrust of his argument throughout the rest of the book. Not only I was righteous, we know he was righteous because the book said he was in chapter 1. We should at least take the book at its face value for that, for the purposes of argument. We know he's supposed to be innocent. We know he's supposed to be righteous. So we have to take him at his word that all of this is wrong. Okay, so before we move on, questions, comments, thoughts? Is there something I just went over way too fast?
Yeah, I have a question. Usually when people, when in the Bible, when people write two different versions of things, it's because they have interest in it. They have either they're poor priests or poor something else. Is there a reason, do you think, that he is questioning what's written in Deuteronomy?
So Deuteronomy is that container for those traditional ideas of Deuteronomy is the most straightforward expression of if you do good stuff, you'll prosper. If you do bad things, you'll suffer. So Deuteronomy is the best place to just attack it directly and say, this doesn't work. You said it works like this, but it doesn't work. We also probably have to remember that the other books of the Torah are not fully formed yet. So to some extent, all he has to attack from the literature is maybe some prophetic texts, Psalms. Proverbs isn't actually fully written yet. Ecclesiastes is not fully written yet. And all he's got from the Torah is Deuteronomy. For sure. So he's going to attack Deuteronomy. So it's not one of those situations where he's telling a different version of the story because he's representing a different class of person. So attacking the whole tradition. And you attack the tradition by quoting the tradition back at it and saying, oh, but you're wrong.
This probably doesn't work with the chronology you just said, but apropos of the Haggadah, there's a kind of echo here of, if I recall it correctly, the wicked child saying, well, hey, you blame Pharaoh for all this, but it says God, in Exodus, God hardened his heart. So how can you blame him for that?
Yeah. So this is one of those interesting situations where hardening hearts is a trope, right? So it shows up in Deuteronomy, it shows up in Exodus. Exodus isn't quite formed yet, but it's a really odd thing to just have shown up in Exodus all of a sudden. So there's probably a good bet that that wicked child thing is dragging along. The thing to remember is the wicked child framing is not the Bible's framing, right? The wicked child framing is the rabbis.
Yeah.
Right. So those verses are just there, and we've received them in a framework where the rabbi said, oh, well, that's what the wicked child says. There's nothing about the wicked child in the Torah. It's just, he's going to ask a question, and this is the answer you give when he asks this question. So it works a little bit differently from the framing we're used to, but actually it's kind of the same idea.
Well, I was wondering the same thing, and it says in Exodus that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and I would imagine that idea was fully formed by the time Job was composed.
It may have,
and there's the same question: why is Pharaoh and the Egyptians punished because of what God made Pharaoh do? There are two sides to that.
Right. So that's always the question: is, well, why did that happen? The other part to keep in mind is we're not going to see Job cite stuff that's very specifically Israelite for two reasons. One, if the intent of the authors was to make it universal, they don't want to easily, plainly just start talking about Moses and the plagues and all of that stuff, because that's the national myth and it's very specific. The other part of it is wisdom literature doesn't ever talk about that, because it just is universal as content, or that's wisdom literature's perspective of itself, right? You don't need any special access to books to know this stuff, although it very obviously helps, I guess. You can just figure this out on your own. It's practical reason. Oh gosh, sorry. I know I just gave somebody a flashback to a class on Immanuel Kant. I apologize for that, but practical reason. Here it is, right? That's what's going on in wisdom literature.
Can I ask, I guess it's more basic. When he says, you know, if I spoke, he probably wouldn't even listen. So is he's kind of starting to question whether God is good or benevolent?
Oh yeah. Yeah. He has reached the point where he says, I'm suffering. I was good. I know I'm right. There can only be one solution to this problem. Logically, Yahweh is not. And that is absolutely where he goes with his argument.
Is not benevolent.
Yeah, I kind of interpreted that as he's so powerful, why will he pay any attention to me?
Yeah, so there's both of those things happening. There is a God is so powerful, why bother with me? And there is this line, if he answered me, I wouldn't believe him.
Right.
Which
Right.
is unbelievable that I'd get an answer, but also I don't trust the answer now.
Right. I don't trust him.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting because the book makes a point of saying over and over that actually Job never cursed God. Right? There's a number of times where it makes that point, but here we are, we're walking right up to the line, and Job does it a bunch of times.
Right.
I don't see it as God not being benevolent. I see it as the concept of benevolent or malevolent doesn't apply to God. He's outside and above that construct. He's simply powerful. He does what he does. Whatever he does is justified because he did it. And our views of what's right and wrong simply don't apply to him.
So this is actually a really interesting problem. And it best gets framed at the end of the book of Job. And when we get to the end of the book of Job, we'll actually come back to this because it really does put all of this stuff in perspective and make you wonder what argument the book thought it was making to begin with. Because there's a way of reading the book of Job to say that every argument Job makes is right. Every argument his friends make is also right. All of these things are contradictory to one another. What is happening here? So when we get to the end, we'll actually really look right at that because it's sitting there waiting for us.
I agree with you and Michael that the picture is of a being who's beyond all of this and just is what he is. On the other hand, I would say semi-jocularly, my ancestor and your ancestors ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Where'd we get that idea from? I remember he told us about that, and now I know good and evil.
Yeah,
I mean, good and evil that applies to them, not to him. Good is following what God wants. Evil is doing what God doesn't want. That doesn't apply to God.
How did God let me break his commandment? But anyway, I think we're way beyond the scope of the fifth session.
yeah, but we'll come back to it because honestly, all of the arguments that are made in the book of Job, if you put fancier words on them and you make them much longer and you put them into prose, this is basically the history of theology for about 2,500 years in the West. The arguments don't change. They really don't. They get fancier words. They get turned into Greek. They get turned into German. The arguments don't change. So we kind of finished friend number 2, Bildad, and we're going to Zophar. Zophar is the last of the 3. Zophar starts out by saying that Job's a liar. The other 2 have been walking up to the edge. Zophar goes for it. And he says, shall a swarm of words be unanswered, and should a smooth talker be in the right? right? This is where we get the phrase smooth talker,
Wow.
is from the Tanakh. Here it is, right there. Your lies may silence folk. You mock and no one protests. And you say, my teaching is spotless and I am pure in your eyes. Yet if only God would speak and would open his lips against you, would tell you wisdom's secrets, for prudence is double-edged. And no, God leaves some of your crime forgotten. Yahweh is going easy on you. Not only are you bad, you're lying about it, and probably he should have just stricken you dead. But he didn't. He's leaving some of your crime forgotten. So this is extra reproof. Just very clearly saying, oh yeah, not only are you wrong and you're lying about it, but you're really bad. And you could be punished a lot worse. So you should probably stop talking now. Like Bildad, Zophar claims Job would have been better off if he would just be honest. If you readied your heart and spread out your palms to him, if there is, so spread out your palms, reach up to the heavens to apologize. If there is wrongdoing in your hand, remove it. Let no mischief dwell in your tents, for then you will raise your face unstained. You will be steadfast and not fear. Just acknowledge you're wrong. Everything will get better if you acknowledge that you, Job, are wrong. And each of his friends keeps coming back to the idea that we've been pushing back against, the idea that Yahweh is just. Every single one of his friends keeps coming at it from the perspective of Yahweh is just. What's been happening to you is because you are bad. There can be no other answer. They will admit to no other answer. Whether that's accurate or not, I mean, it's impossible to kind of empirically prove any of this stuff, right? But Job's point is, you keep saying this, and yet, how did I go from so high to so low and I did nothing different? So Job just outright says, the wisdom, you guys are wrong. Oh yes, you are the people. And with you, wisdom will die. But I too have a mind like you. I am no less than you, and who does not know such things? A laughingstock to his friend am I, who calls his God and is answered, a laughingstock of the blameless just man. And I've put Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar here because each of these is a capsule summary of each of these guys' arguments. And the verse is very clearly in the Hebrew split into thirds. So it's this Eliphaz. Oh, you can't be serious. Bildad. Well, if you would just reach out. And Zophar, you're a liar. Right? That's the capsule summary of their arguments. And this is how it's being represented in the poem. So we're actually capturing each of these guys in the structure of the text. Which is, again, if you just rely on a translation, sometimes this stuff doesn't come through, right? Lost in Translation is a movie, but it's also a real thing. Job responds, this really is Yahweh's fault, and I am powerless to resist. With him are wisdom and strength. He possesses counsel and understanding. Why he destroys and there is no rebuilding, closes in on a man, leaves no opening. Holds back the waters and they dry up, sends them forth and they turn the earth over. With him is power and prudence, his the duped and the duper. They grope in darkness without light. He makes them wander like drunken men. So this is, again, if I'm doing something wrong, it's because you made me. You have all the wisdom. You have all the understanding. I am powerless. You keep it from raining. You let the rain out. His the duped and the duper. It is Yahweh who decides who is fooled and who fools, not any person. They grope in darkness without light. He makes them wander like drunken men. So again, we're getting this, no, you made me. This is not my fault. If I did something wrong, I wasn't aware of it. You made me do it. But I didn't do anything wrong. Hear, pray, my dispute. So now we're asking, this is Job responding to Zophar now and saying, hear my dispute, listen closely. Would you speak crookedness of God, and would you speak false things? This is Job now saying, you're accusing God of punishing me. I've been just. This can't be because God is punishing me. Would you be partial on his behalf? Would you plead the case of God? Would it be good that he problem you? As one mocks a man, would you mock him? He will surely dispute with you if in secret you are partial. Your pronouncements are maxims of ash, your word piles of clay. Everything you're saying is worthless. You are in fact speaking ill of God by saying that God is punishing me. You think you're being partial on God's behalf, but really you're not. He will surely dispute with you if in secret you are partial. This is foreshadowing. Because when we get to chapter 38, Yahweh comes in a whirlwind, interrupts the proceedings, starts yelling at Job, and then at the end, he actually tells Job's friends that they were wrong, which is part of what complicates what the message of the book is, assuming there's a message. So this is Job for giving us a little foreshadowing of what's coming. If in secret you're partial, well, God doesn't want you to be partial. He wants you to be fair. And he's going to come tell you that you're wrong. Okay. A pause and a deep breath. Because we went through a lot of stuff in a short period of time. So I want to recap where we are, in part because we're not going to belabor ourselves too much more with Job's friends, because they just keep making the same arguments. So other than reading a whole bunch of poetry, there's not a lot to gain from it. So we know what's happened narrative-wise. There's a bet. Job wishes for death. His friends respond with conventional wisdom. You are imperfect. You must be wicked. You're lying about your innocence. Yahweh is just. Demands his innocence, demands a hearing before Yahweh, says, I'm innocent and you are wrong. And this is 5 bullet points, and we've captured everything that everybody said. It's not a sophisticated argument, actually. The author of Job has been subtly attacking the biblical tradition, so we've seen him tearing apart bits of Deuteronomy, pulling in pieces of the Psalms, puts traditional verses and paraphrases into the mouths of Job's friends and subversions into Job's mouth. And he's pulling in all of the extant literature that people have accepted to this point. So he's pulling in the wisdom literature because he's part of the wisdom tradition. He's pulling in the Psalms, which are really the liturgy of the temple, or that's the suspicion. And then he's bringing in, I'm calling it the Deuteronomistic tradition. That's a little bit more broad than what he's doing. He's really pulling in Deuteronomy and saying, okay, these are the principles. They don't work. And I'm tearing apart pieces of Deuteronomy so that you can get clued into that. So we kind of know, I think it's fair to say, we kind of know that these were definitely accessible at the time. We can't be quite as sure about Exodus and Numbers. And in any event, wisdom literature doesn't focus on the big national myth. So it's not, we wouldn't expect to get really, really specific references. But we do get the liturgy of public worship, the Psalms, there's not a really bright line between what's in the Psalms and what's in wisdom literature like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job. So it's useful to know. It's not a fine line, and we'll actually see when we look at comparable ancient Near Eastern texts that there's not a fine line there either. That this is kind of an arbitrary distinction. These liturgical pieces and the wisdom tradition, that they really are very. There's a lot that they share. The Psalms actually don't make a ton of reference sometimes to ancient Israelite myths, although sometimes they do. So this is where we are now. What happens next is we get 2 more cycles of Job and his friends arguing. The argument gets more and more intense in terms of the attacks upon one another, who's lying and who's not. Job is a righteous man. Yahweh is as powerful as the tradition claims, but his justice is not all that the tradition seems to say it should be. Job knows he's righteous, believes he's owed an explanation, wants a chance to plead his case. No chance has been forthcoming, and the more he argues, the more his friends simply dig into the idea that you're lying and you should just come clean. You're bad. You did something that was bad. And the sooner you admit it, the sooner you'll be prosperous again. We're going to spare ourselves about 15 chapters of this, maybe a little bit more. We'll also spare ourselves, Job has a really long oration after all of this is done. We'll spare ourselves that too. We've touched all the themes. And then, Elihu intercedes, or you fuddy-duddies are getting this all wrong. Elihu just kind of comes out of nowhere. He's not mentioned in the narrative. We don't know where he comes from. Just there he is at one point. Just appears in Job chapter 32. You know, we're 3/4 of the way through the book. Here's a new character. And the text says these 3 men left off answering Job because he was right in his own eyes. So the text is not actually saying yet that Job was right. It's just saying Job is convinced of his own argument and he's not listening. And Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite from the clan of Ram, whatever clan that is, flared up in anger against Job. His anger flared for his claiming to be in the right more than God. And against his 3 companions, his anger flared because they hadn't found an answer that showed Job guilty. Again, we have somebody coming to the picture who says, Job has to be guilty because he's suffering. And that's how this all goes. If you're bad, you suffer. Job must be guilty. You guys failed to do it. I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore, I was awed and feared to speak my mind with you. I have waited for your speech, hearkened to your understandings while you tested words. And I attended to you, and look, Job has no refuter, none to answer his talk among you. I will show favor to no man, nor flattery any person, for if I knew how to flatter, my maker would soon take me away. So this is some young guy, we don't know who it is, who just shows up and says, well, you guys failed. I'm tired of listening to you. I listened. You were older than me. I listened. I listened to my elders, and now I'm going to show you all how you were wrong. And Elihu has 4 speeches. And I don't think I'm going to spoil anything much for you when I say Elihu's 4 speeches are not in substance much different from Job's friends. So what Elihu is supposed to actually prove, who knows? Why, I am like you to God. From clay I too was pinched. Look, where you fail to be right, I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend with him, if he answers not all of man's words? For God speaks in one way or in 2, and no one perceives him. In a dream, a night's vision, when slumber falls upon men, in sleep upon their couch. Why are you even asking God to talk to you? That's not how God talks to people. You have dreams. That's how God talks to you. No one is going to come down from heaven and answer your questions. You aren't entitled to plead with God. These things happen to you. Accept it. Of course, this is the Bible, and in the Bible, God does come down and talk to people. So that's its own issue. But Elihu essentially decides that he's going to step in and represent God because God's not going to come down and argue this dispute. Where you fail to be right, I will answer you, for God is greater than man. I have written in my notebook, as I was reading this section, what did I write? I have written in the margin, wow, Elihu is an ass. Because here is this, I'm great. I'll step in for God. So that's his first speech. His second speech, Job, you're wrong. You deserve your punishment. Who is a man like Job, lapping up scorn like water? He consorts with wrongdoers and walks with wicked men. For he has said, what use to a man to find favor with God? Therefore, discerning men, hear me. Far be from God any wickedness, from Shaddai any wrong. Again, Elihu is just taking everybody's assumptions and walking forward with them. There aren't really a lot of new arguments, except that Elihu's even more arrogant than the other people. He has two more speeches. He continues on. We're not going to dissect them terribly. God is righteous. He doesn't permit the wicked to live, and he grants justice to the afflicted. Those who are righteous, who repent of evil, live the rest of their lives well. The wicked are so consumed they don't even notice their own deaths. It's phrased somewhat more poetically. It's something like they're so consumed they know not that they descend into shadow, or something like that. But it's comparing the righteous who live the rest of their lives well and die contented. And then Elihu demands to know whether Job shares God's power over lightning and thunder, and whether Job can shape the sky. So having used up all of the arguments about justice, he finally goes, plus you're not as powerful as God. So just stop talking now. And then it's 8:30, which is not actually what it says in the book of Job, but it also happens to be true. So I'm saving the not best for last. So we'll do one more round. I didn't actually think we'd get all the way to here, that we'd get anywhere past here. We have Yahweh's response to look at. Then we have the opportunity to tear apart the connections of Job to ancient Near Eastern literature and Job's connections to ancient Near Eastern mythology. Because we again have to stop and think, okay, we view Job as a kind of skeptic predecessor, but we have to make sure we understand what kind of skeptic he is. He's not exactly a skeptic of everything, so much as he's skeptical of the biblical tradition's seeming guarantees of the righteous prospering and the wicked suffering.
Right.
So, any questions at this point?
Remind me, is Shaddai, is that another?
Yeah, so Job does this thing where it separates El and Shaddai for just poetic purposes, so that it doesn't say El Shaddai twice in a row, but Shaddai, the typical translation, when you see God Almighty used in a lot of translations, El is God, Shaddai is the Almighty part.
The Almighty, okay. So it's equivalent, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so Job just breaks them into multiple lines so that he's not saying El Shaddai twice, right?
Okay.
Because you start to run out of things to say if you don't use your words sparingly. Other questions?
That last line of Elihu that you paraphrased about, hey, you're powerless. Are you there doing the lightning? And so that foreshadows a chunk of God's own argument, right?
Yes. It foreshadows a chunk of God's own argument. Interestingly, the last time Elihu opens his mouth is the last time we hear about Elihu at all in Job. So Job has given Elihu like 5 chapters, all of these speeches, 4 separate speeches, and he's no longer a character after this. So it almost seems like Elihu's stuff was out there and somebody put it in and adapted it for Job a little bit, and it wasn't part of the narrative. So it's almost like this disposable piece because he's not saying anything different from anybody else. He just thinks he's saying something different, which happens a lot. Okay, so we'll stop here and we will start next week with "and then." And then is kind of, should be the narrative climax of the book. And it's kind of not.
Great.
Oh.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.